Prominent Russian journalist and political activist Vladimir Kara-Murza has been convicted of treason and spreading disinformation about the Russian military. He has been sentenced to 25 years in a Russian labor camp as a result of the conviction. Kara-Murza had denied the charges and compared his case to the Stalin-era show trials. And Yuri is our former Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Reshetto. He joins me now from Riga, as DW has been banned from reporting in Russia. So, Yuri, the news just before you came on air, we were looking at live pictures coming from the court. But we now have that verdict. Vladimir Kara-Murza has been found guilty in that court for treason and for spreading disinformation. He's also been sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp. Does this verdict, Yuri, come as a surprise?
No, Christine, even though this was a so-called closed trial, that means that the media was not allowed to be present. For the politician himself and for the critical observers, for journalists, this was a politically motivated and unfair trial in which Kara-Murza had no chance to be treated fairly. Officially, Kara-Murza has been charged with different things, including spreading false information about the Russian army, you mentioned it, and treason. As for treason, according to the investigators, Kara-Murza was paid to help organizations from NATO countries, it's said, undermine Russia's national security. It's not specified what exactly was meant. Also, he is accused of spreading false information about the Russian armed forces. This is a wartime censorship law that was introduced shortly after the start of the so-called special military operation. That's what the war is called in Russia.
Yuri, we're talking about somebody who many refer to as, a really strong critic, or one of the strongest critics in Russia today. Could you tell us a little bit more about Vladimir Kara-Murza's work and the activism that has landed him in the trouble that he's in with the government?
Yes, Christine, he was one of the most, let's say, important and open critics of President Vladimir Putin. He was a journalist. He worked with the opposition politician Boris Nemtsov, who was killed 2015 in Moscow near the Kremlin, and he worked later for the NGO of fellow Kremlin critic Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the former oligarch who now lives abroad and who himself spent 10 years in prison for posing as a possible presidential candidate at that time against the incumbent President Putin. Khodorkovsky's organization, in which Kara-Murza worked, however, was classified as extremist in Russia, and Kara-Murza had many connections abroad, especially in the United States, where his family lives, and he's got two passports, the Russian and the British one.
Yuri, what does this verdict mean for the Russian opposition and for people who dare to protest against President Vladimir Putin?
There are plenty of Russians still who are very critical of the Kremlin. I can say if their number is growing because there are simply no reliable surveys anymore. But I would still be able to say that, yes, more and more people are criticizing Putin and the life in Russia, because this life in Russia is simply getting harder and harder. That's fact. Prices are constantly rising, the ruble is falling, and the goals of the so-called military special operations have not been achieved. But people grumble against the government in their kitchens. They dare less and less to speak openly. This so-called kitchen opposition is there, but it's not organized in any way. The other political opposition in the democratic Western sense doesn't exist anymore in Russia. And with the punishment of Kara-Murza, with this 25-year sentence behind bars, this opposition no longer has a single prominent face anymore in Russia.
All right, that is our Yuri Reshetto reporting for us from Riga there on the news of the prominent Russian journalist and political activist Vladimir Kara-Murza being sentenced to 25 years in prison on the charges of treason and spreading disinformation. Thank you, Yuri.